I discovered my father baby-trapped my mom and stole $700,000 in child support meant for me. For 2 decades, I lived with a burning hatred, convinced my mother had abandoned me and ruined our lives. I built my entire identity around her betrayal, around the simple story that painted my dad as a hero and her as the villain. But then, one single Instagram post shattered everything I thought I knew, revealing a truth so twisted, so utterly depraved, it turned my world upside down and exposed the real monster I'd actually been living with all along. My childhood narrative was etched in stone. Mom walked out when I was just 2. Dad, my rock, worked 3 jobs, sacrificing everything to keep us afloat, while my grandma stepped in to raise me. Mom was the heartless woman who chose freedom over her family, leaving a gaping wound in my life. Then, I found her. Or rather, her Instagram. My breath caught in my throat. She was living in Paris, of all places, the head chef at a Michelin-starred restaurant. And her husband? He looked like he'd stepped straight out of a Vogue magazine. The shock was immense, quickly replaced by a white-hot rage that simmered and then boiled over. I spent 40 agonizing minutes typing a message, pouring out every ounce of venom I had. I called her every name I knew, told her karma would come for her for abandoning her daughter. Her response hit my inbox in 3 minutes flat. Just 4 words: "You deserve to say this to my face. I'll fly you here." I went. Without telling anyone, without a second thought. She met me at Charles de Gaulle, and the woman standing before me looked nothing like the monster I'd conjured in my mind for 20 years. Her eyes held a deep, quiet sadness I couldn't yet comprehend. We drove straight to her restaurant. For an hour, I screamed at her, unleashing every hurt, every accusation, every buried resentment. She just sat there, taking it all, silent tears streaming down her face. Finally, hoarse and drained, I choked out, "Why? Why did you leave?" Her answer was a whisper, but it landed like a hammer blow: "Your father trapped me." "That's your excuse?" I scoffed, my voice dripping with disbelief. She pulled out her phone. "I have proof." What she showed me next were medical records. Pages detailing her conversation with a doctor. She was 22, severely depressed, not ready for a child, considering termination. And my father? He'd threatened to destroy her career, her life, everything she had, unless she had me. But then, she did leave, after 2 years of trying to make it work. She scrolled through more documents, psychiatric evaluations, a diagnosis of severe postpartum psychosis, intrusive thoughts about hurting me, about hurting herself. Then, the most sickening revelation of all, on my 2nd birthday, she found out he'd sabotaged her birth control to get her pregnant in the first place. That night, she attempted suicide. The involuntary commitment papers were dated on my birthday. The court declared her unfit, and he got full custody. "But I've paid child support every month for 18 years, she insisted. My mind reeled. "We never got a dime from you. Dad worked overtime constantly, we couldn't even afford SAT prep." She showed me bank statements, $3,000 monthly, a total of over $700,000. All cashed by my father. My blood ran cold. I immediately called him, putting him on speaker without warning. "Dad," I said, my voice shaking, "did Mom ever pay child support?" His voice was too quick, too smooth. "Your mother never sent a dime." "Why?" I hung up. My mother, with a steady hand, pulled out her laptop. She logged into Facebook, found his hidden profile, the one he thought I couldn't see. Vegas trips, a motorcycle collection, a boat, investment properties, all while telling me we couldn't afford my college applications. "He stole your future to punish me," she said, her voice heavy with grief. A forensic accountant confirmed everything, over $800,000 with interest, hidden across 17 different accounts. The judge ordered full restitution, plus damages. My father called me, sobbing. "You're destroying our family," he cried. My response was calm, chillingly clear: "You destroyed it when you baby-trapped a woman, stole her money, and made me hate her for 20 years. My grandmother, bless her heart, finally confessed she knew." He's my son. What could I do? Tell the truth, I said. That's what you could do. That was 8 months ago. I'm in therapy now, paid for with the recovered money, slowly, painfully learning to rebuild a relationship with my mother. She introduces me as her daughter now, with tears in her eyes every single time. It's fragile, but it's real. But yesterday, everything changed again. My therapist, Dr. Rodriguez, who'd been helping me process all this, asked to see me urgently. I need to show you something, she said, her voice tight. I could lose my license for this, but you deserve to know. She pulled out a file. Your father was my patient 15 years ago. Different last name. I didn't connect it until you mentioned your grandmother's maiden name. Inside were session notes. My father talking about his perfect plan. How he'd targeted my mother specifically because she had wealthy parents. How he'd researched family law, knew mothers rarely lose custody unless they're declared unfit. How he meticulously documented her depression, saved every piece of evidence, planning everything. There's more, Dr. Rodriguez said, her hands shaking. He talks about another woman before your mother. The notes described a college girlfriend who got away by having an abortion after he tried to trap her. Her name was blacked out, but one detail wasn't: she'd moved to Austin after graduating. He says he made sure the second one couldn't escape. Dr. Rodriguez read the chilling words aloud. He learned from his mistakes. My mother wasn't his first victim. There's one more thing. She showed me the last page. He mentions keeping insurance on my mother. Something that would destroy her career if it got out. He called it his nuclear option if she ever tried to come back. My phone buzzed. A text from my father. Saw you're in contact with your mother. Remember? I still have those photos from her breakdown. The ones with you. Sure would be a shame if her fancy restaurant saw what kind of mother she really was. Another text, this time a photo. My mother, clearly in psychosis, being restrained by police. 2-year-old me, screaming in the background, my tiny hands clamped over my ears. A third text, drop the lawsuit or these go viral. You have 24 hours. I looked at Dr. Rodriguez. Can you testify about these notes? I'll lose my license, she said, her gaze steady. But yes. My phone rang. My mother. Sophie, I just got an email from your father. He has photos from my breakdown. He's threatening to send them to my employer, my husband, everyone. I could lose everything I've rebuilt. Mom, I said, a new resolve hardening my voice. I don't care. Let him. But Sophie, there's something else, she stammered. The first woman he trapped. I found her. She wants to talk to you. I hung up and immediately called her back, my fingers barely working. As I tapped her contact, Dr. Rodriguez pushed a notepad across her desk with a name and phone number, Alicia Noonan. She whispered that she'd tracked the woman down through old university records. My mother answered on the first ring. I told her not to respond to anything from my father yet, that we needed to get everyone together before making any moves. She agreed, her voice tight with fear. Dr. Rodriguez mouthed Alicia Noonan and pointed to the notepad. I opened a new text message, hands shaking, and typed Alicia's number. Hi, I'm the daughter my father successfully trapped another woman into having. I barely hit send before 3 dots appeared. She was typing back. She asked if we could video chat right now. My heart pounded in my throat as I opened the app. Her face filled my screen, a woman in her early 40s with kind eyes and visible tension in her shoulders. She started talking immediately, her words coming fast, like she'd been waiting 20 years to say them to someone who would finally understand. She was 19 when my father targeted her, specifically because her parents had money and she wanted to be a doctor. He seemed perfect at first, supportive, loving, everything she thought she wanted. He sabotaged her birth control by poking holes in condoms and replacing her pills with sugar pills bought online. She found out she was 6 weeks pregnant when she went to the campus health center for what she thought was the flu. She terminated the pregnancy at a clinic 2 hours away, despite his threats to ruin her medical school applications. Her voice stayed steady, but her hands gripped her coffee mug so tight her knuckles were white. She pulled up old emails, turning her laptop screen towards the camera. Messages from my father, 2 decades old, threatening to tell her conservative parents about the abortion and contact every medical school she applied to, citing character concerns. Her voice cracked as she explained she had to get a restraining order and transfer universities to escape him. She'd spent 2 years looking over her shoulder, 3 more in therapy learning to trust people again. I stared at her through my phone screen, the horrifying realization washing over me: my father had been doing this for over 2 decades. I was the only child who resulted from his traps because Alicia got away, and my mother couldn't. The pattern was so calculated, it made me physically sick. My stomach churned, feeling like I might throw up right there in Dr. Rodriguez's office. But Alicia said she would testify about everything if it helped stop him from hurting anyone else. Dr. Rodriguez leaned into the camera. She explained she could face a licensing board investigation for revealing patient information, but she was willing to risk it. My father's notes described his tactics like a how-to guide for trapping women. She'd already contacted a lawyer about whistleblower protections and mandatory reporting exceptions for cases involving ongoing harm. Her voice was quiet but firm: some things matter more than a license. I asked Alicia if she knew about other women my father might have targeted. She nodded slowly, saying he bragged in college about having a type: ambitious women from wealthy families whom he could lock down with pregnancy. She remembered him obsessing over another pre-law student named Hannah after Alicia escaped, following her around campus, showing up at her study group uninvited until campus security got involved. My phone buzzed again with another text from my father. A second photo of my mother being restrained by police, this one a close-up so you could see her face twisted in agony, and 2-year-old me screaming in the corner. The message below read just 2 words and a number: 23 hours. My stomach turned. He was counting down like this was some kind of game he was winning. I saved the screenshot and immediately forwarded it to my mother and Dr. Rodriguez. Then, I pulled up Rowan Marshall's contact, the attorney my mother hired for the financial lawsuit, who'd already proven he knew how to fight my father. He answered on the second ring. I explained the blackmail, Dr. Rodriguez's revelations about the 2-decade pattern of victims. My words tumbled out so fast I had to stop and breathe halfway through. He was quiet for maybe 5 seconds after I finished, then said, "This changes everything. We needed to document the threats as extortion while building a bigger case that showed systematic abuse across multiple victims." His voice shifted into crisp, focused lawyer mode, asking me to forward every text and email immediately and not to respond to my father under any circumstances until we had a strategy. Rowan put me on hold, and I heard him dialing another number, his voice shifting into sharp legal speak as he explained the situation to someone at the district attorney's office. Dr. Rodriguez watched me from across her desk, her hands still resting on those therapy notes like she needed to keep them grounded in reality. Rowan came back on the line. He'd just spoken with Kenneth Harmon, the DA who handles blackmail and harassment cases, and they wanted copies of everything within the hour. He warned me this was going to get worse before it got better. My father would probably lash out when he realized we were building a criminal case, but the countdown clock meant we couldn't wait for him to make the first move. I was saving screenshots when my phone buzzed with an incoming call from my mother. I answered to hear both her and Victor on speakerphone. My mother's voice was shaking. "Sophie, the restaurant's board of directors just received an anonymous email with one of the breakdown photos attached. The message claims to be from a concerned party, questioning whether someone with my history of mental problems should be running a kitchen where she has access to knives." Victor cut in, his accent thicker than usual with anger, saying he wanted to fly here right now and confront my father face to face. I put them on speaker so Rowan could hear. He immediately told Victor that any direct contact could mess up the legal case, that my father wanted exactly that kind of confrontation so he could play the victim. My mother made a sound I'd never heard from her before, something between a sob and a growl. She said she'd spent 20 years being ashamed and scared, but something just broke inside her when she saw that email. She sounded different, like the fear was still there, but it was mixed with something harder now, something that wouldn't back down anymore. Rowan suggested we set up a conference call with everyone involved. For the next 3 hours, I was on my phone with him, Dr. Rodriguez, my mother, and Alicia. All of us talking over each other at first until we settled into what felt like a war council. We mapped out a strategy: get ahead of my father's blackmail by taking control of the story ourselves, telling the truth about my mother's postpartum psychosis and his exploitation before he could weaponize it against her. Dr. Rodriguez explained she needed to report her ethical breach to the licensing board before my father or anyone else did, framing it as mandatory reporting of ongoing abuse and a pattern of harm that she had a duty to expose. Her hands shook as she pulled up the licensing board website, but she kept saying that staying quiet would be worse than losing her license, that she couldn't let my father hurt anyone else just to protect her career. Alicia told us she was booking a flight to arrive tomorrow morning, taking emergency leave from her job as a hospital administrator to help build the case in person. She sounded scared but determined, her voice cracking when she said she'd spent 20 years wondering if my father did this to other women, if she could have stopped him somehow by speaking up sooner. Rowan told us he was filing an emergency restraining order against my father right now, tonight, based on the blackmail texts and the therapy notes showing a pattern of harassment and abuse. He explained that judges take these things seriously when there's documented evidence of threats, especially when the victim is trying to protect others, too. Dr. Rodriguez emailed him the relevant pages from the therapy notes, the ones where my father described his insurance policy and his plans to destroy my mother if she ever came back into my life. 2 hours later, Rowan called back to say the judge granted a temporary restraining order that forbade my father from contacting me, my mother, or distributing any of those photos to anyone. The order was effective immediately, and violation carried serious penalties, including jail time. My phone buzzed with a text from my father less than an hour after the restraining order went through. The message just said, "You'll regret this." And below it was a photo of my childhood home, the house where I grew up thinking he was a hero. I screenshot it immediately and sent it to Rowan. My hands were steadier than I expected. Rowan called back within minutes. "This is exactly why we needed that restraining order. Your father just broke it and made our case stronger." He'd already forwarded everything to Kenneth Harmon, who apparently said that immediate violations show a pattern of harassment and prove the subject can't control his behavior. "This violation helps the criminal case a lot," Kenneth had told him. "Gives us leverage to push for actual charges instead of just the restraining order." I opened my private social media accounts and started typing, my fingers moving faster than my thoughts. I explained that my mother had severe postpartum psychosis when I was 2, that it's a real medical condition that affects thousands of women, and that my father exploited her illness and documented her worst moments to use against her 20 years later. I said that anyone who receives photos of her breakdown should know they're part of a blackmail campaign by someone who trapped her into pregnancy and stole her child support for 2 decades. My mother posted something similar on her accounts, her words careful and clear about the medical reality of her condition and how my father weaponized it. Victor posted a statement from the restaurant addressing the malicious allegations, explaining that the board stood behind my mother completely and recognized the email for what it was: harassment from someone trying to damage her career. The response came faster than I expected, my phone lighting up with notifications as dozens of people commented and messaged. Several of my mother's colleagues from other restaurants shared their own stories about postpartum depression and anxiety, talking about how the stigma almost destroyed their careers. 3 women sent me direct messages saying my father's name sounded familiar from their pasts, that they thought they might have dated him years ago. I forwarded everything to Rowan immediately, like he told me to, watching the message count climb as more people responded with support and their own experiences. One message stood out, a woman named Courtney who said she dated my father 8 years ago and had a story that sounded a lot like what happened to my mother and Alicia. I clicked on Courtney's message, my stomach getting tighter with every line. She told me she met my father 8 years ago at a coffee shop when she was 23, working her first real job. He was charming and attentive, told her he was a contractor, that his ex-wife had cheated on him. They dated for 3 months before she got pregnant. When she panicked, he held her hands and said he'd had a vasectomy years ago, so this was meant to be. They were supposed to start a family together. He talked about baby names, looking at bigger apartments, making her feel safe about keeping it even though she wasn't ready. Then, at 12 weeks, she started bleeding at work and went to the emergency room alone because he said he had a job he couldn't miss. She lost the baby that night, texted him from the hospital, and he never responded. His phone went straight to voicemail the next day, and when she drove to his apartment, the landlord said he'd moved out 2 days before without giving notice. She found out 6 months later through a mutual friend that he'd been seeing 2 other women at the same time, both younger than her, and he'd told them the same vasectomy story. Courtney ended the message saying she spent 8 years thinking she was stupid for believing him, but reading my post made her realize he'd done this to multiple women, and she wanted to help however she could. I forwarded everything to Rowan immediately and texted him that we had another victim with documentation. He called back within 10 minutes, asking if Courtney would talk to him and Alicia, that hearing from other survivors might help her process what happened. I messaged Courtney, asking if she was willing to do a video call with my lawyer and the first woman my father targeted, explaining that we were building a case and her story mattered. She responded yes before I even finished typing the next message. Rowan set up the call for that evening, sending the link to me, Alicia, and Courtney. When we all connected at 7, Courtney looked tired but determined, her dark hair pulled back, her eyes red like she'd been crying. Alicia introduced herself and explained what my father did to her in college. I watched Courtney's face crumble as she realized the pattern went back even further than she thought. She told us everything again, this time with more details about how he love-bombed her in the beginning, showing up at her office with coffee, texting her constantly, making her feel like the center of his world. Then he started suggesting she spend less time with her friends because they didn't understand their connection, that her family was too controlling and she should create distance. By the time she got pregnant, she'd isolated herself so completely that she had no one to talk to about her fears. And he used that isolation to pressure her into keeping it. When she lost the baby, he disappeared like she'd never existed, and she spent months blaming herself for not being enough to make him stay. Alicia was crying Why the end, telling Courtney it wasn't her fault, that our father was a predator who targeted vulnerable women systematically. Courtney pulled out her laptop and showed us emails he sent during those 3 months. Dozens of messages talking about their future and what kind of parents they'd be, picking out baby names and discussing whether they wanted a boy or a girl first. The emails were so manipulative, it made me sick, every line designed to make her feel safe and loved while he trapped her. Rowan was taking notes the whole time, asking specific questions about timeline and whether she had any proof he was seeing other women simultaneously. Courtney said she had screenshots of text messages from the mutual friend who told her about the other women, plus she'd kept a journal during that time documenting everything because her therapist suggested it. She agreed to send everything to Rowan and sign a statement. 3 days later, Rowan called me with news. The private investigator found Hannah Levig in Seattle. She was a public defender now, 38 years old, and when the investigator contacted her, she refused to talk at first. I asked Rowan if I could reach out to her directly, and he gave me her email address with permission to send the therapy notes that mentioned her by name. I wrote her a careful message explaining who I was, that my father targeted my mother and at least 3 other women we knew of, and that Dr. Rodriguez's notes from 15 years ago mentioned a pre-law student he stalked after his first victim escaped. I attached the relevant pages with her name and sent it before I could second-guess myself. Hannah called me at midnight that same night. I answered to the sound of someone crying so hard they could barely breathe. She told me she'd been in therapy for 15 years trying to convince herself she wasn't crazy, that what my father did was real abuse, even though he never hit her. After Alicia escaped by having an abortion, my father fixated on Hannah during their senior year of college. He started showing up everywhere she studied, at the library, at coffee shops, even outside her dorm. He sent gifts to her room, flowers, books, jewelry, always with notes about how they were meant to be together. She tried to ignore him, but he escalated, following her to classes and waiting outside when they ended, showing up at parties she attended. She finally agreed to go on one date with him, hoping it would make him stop. And he acted like that one date meant they were in a relationship. 2 months later, she realized she was pregnant, even though they'd used condoms every time. When she confronted him, he admitted he'd been tampering with them because he knew she was meant to be the mother of his children. He actually said those words to her, that they were meant to have a family together, and he'd made sure it would happen. Hannah had an abortion at 8 weeks and transferred to a different law school across the country, changing her phone number and blocking him on everything. She'd been terrified for 15 years that he'd find her again. Hearing there were other victims made her sob with something between relief and rage. I stayed on the phone with her for 2 hours, listening to her story and telling her about my mother, Alicia, and Courtney. By the end, she agreed to talk to Rowan and provide a statement, saying she wanted my father to face consequences for what he'd done to all of us. Rowan scheduled another video call, and now we had 4 women spanning 20 years, all describing the same pattern of reproductive coercion and manipulation. He compiled all the testimony and evidence and sent it to Kenneth Harmon, explaining that this wasn't just about blackmail and stolen child support anymore. Kenneth called me directly 2 days later, saying the pattern evidence could support additional charges, including stalking, harassment, and fraud. That my father's behavior showed clear intent to trap and control women through pregnancy. He sounded angry in a way that made me think he had daughters of his own. My phone rang while I was still processing Kenneth's call, and I saw it was my grandmother calling for the first time since I confronted her about knowing the truth. I remembered Rowan telling me to record any contact from family members, so I started the recording app before I answered. She was crying immediately, her voice shaking as she told me my father was not a monster and I was destroying our family over mistakes he made when he was young. She said everyone makes bad choices and I should forgive him because he's my father and family is supposed to stick together no matter what. I felt something cold settle in my chest as I listened to her defend him. I told her that targeting multiple women over 2 decades isn't a mistake. I explained that it's a pattern, that he's a predator who's been doing this since college, and her protection of him enabled him to keep hurting people. She started crying harder and said I was being cruel, that I didn't understand what it's like to watch your child suffer consequences. I told her I understood exactly what it's like, because I watched my mother suffer consequences for 20 years for something that wasn't her fault, consequences my grandmother helped create by staying silent. She hung up on me without saying goodbye. I sat there holding my phone, feeling the family fracture in real time. But there was also this strange sense of clarity, like I could finally see everyone's true priorities, and mine were different from theirs. I saved the recording and sent it to Rowan, who said it might be useful if my grandmother tried to testify on my father's behalf. 2 hours later, Dr. Rodriguez called with news. 2 more women contacted her office after seeing my social media posts. Both of them claimed my father did similar things to them, one in her early 20s, one in her 30s, and they were willing to provide statements. The licensing board investigator who was reviewing Dr. Rodriguez's ethical breach was now interested in the therapy notes as evidence of a serial predator, rather than just a violation of patient confidentiality. Dr. Rodriguez sounded exhausted but also relieved, like she'd been carrying the weight of those notes alone for 15 years, and finally had help. My mother and Victor landed the next morning. I met them at Rowan's office where Alicia was already waiting. The moment my mother walked through the door and saw Alicia standing there, both of them froze for a second before rushing together. They hugged like survivors of the same disaster meeting 20 years later, both crying. I watched this woman my father hurt first embrace the woman he hurt second, while I stood there as proof of his success with the 3rd attempt. Alicia kept saying she was sorry, that she should have warned people somehow. My mother kept shaking her head, saying there was no way to know he'd keep doing this. Victor put his hand on my shoulder and squeezed gently. Rowan gave everyone a minute before clearing his throat and gesturing to the conference table. He spent the next 6 hours going through everything, spreading documents across every surface until the table looked like a crime scene investigation board, bank statements showing my father cashing child support checks, medical records from my mother's breakdown, emails from Alicia's restraining order, text messages from Courtney about the fake vasectomy, therapy notes describing my father's planning, social media posts from the women who contacted me after seeing my story. Kenneth Harmon arrived around noon and sat down with his notepad, listening to each woman tell her piece of the story while taking notes. He asked detailed questions about dates, locations, evidence, and I could see him building a case in real time. When we finished, he leaned back in his chair and said they could charge my father with extortion for the blackmail texts, fraud for stealing the child support money, stalking based on the pattern of targeting and following women, and reproductive coercion depending on how the state laws applied. He explained that having multiple victims across 2 decades made this clearly calculated behavior, not isolated incidents or mistakes. The pattern evidence was strong enough that a jury would see my father knew exactly what he was doing each time. My father's lawyer called Rowan the next day, trying to negotiate, claiming the blackmail was just emotional distress from a father worried about his daughter and offering to return some of the stolen money if we dropped the criminal charges. Rowan put him on speaker so we could all hear, and the lawyer's voice was smooth and reasonable, talking about how families should work things out privately and how my father had already suffered enough. Rowan waited until he finished and then said no in the flattest voice I've ever heard. He told the lawyer he was filing additional civil suits on behalf of my mother for emotional distress and fraud, and that Kenneth Harmon was moving forward with criminal charges regardless of any negotiation attempts. The lawyer sputtered something about everyone being unreasonable and Rowan hung up. Courtney's brother, Felix, messaged me that evening, saying he worked in tech and wanted to help track down any other evidence of my father's activities online. He ran searches using my father's old usernames and email addresses, digging through archived websites and deleted social media accounts. 3 days later, he called me sounding shocked and sent me a link to a deleted blog from 15 years ago. The blog was archived on an old backup site, and my father wrote about dating strategies and relationship advice under a fake name. I started reading and felt sick within minutes because the posts described love bombing techniques, isolation tactics, and something he called baby trap advantages in language so cold it sounded like instructions. Felix had already preserved everything with timestamps and metadata, creating a digital evidence file that showed my father was literally writing guides on how to trap women. Kenneth Harmon came back to Rowan's office to review the blog posts, and I watched his face change as he read. He was a prosecutor who'd seen plenty of bad cases, but even he looked disturbed by how calculated the writing was. My father described targeting women with good careers and family money, earning their trust through intense attention, then creating pregnancy situations they couldn't escape from. He wrote about documenting their struggles to use against them later, about how family courts favor fathers if mothers seem unstable, about keeping insurance material for future leverage. Felix had found over 50 posts spanning 3 years, all archived and authenticated. Kenneth said this evidence made the case even stronger because it showed premeditation and pattern going back further than any of us knew. Hannah called me the next morning from Seattle, saying she needed to face this after running for 15 years. She booked a flight to arrive that afternoon, and suddenly our coalition grew to 6 women, plus Victor and Felix as allies. We met at a coffee shop near Rowan's office, and there was something powerful about sitting together in person. Alicia and Hannah recognized each other from college and hugged, both of them crying about the 20 years they'd spent apart while my father kept hunting. Courtney brought her therapy journal from 8 years ago, and we compared notes about his tactics. The love bombing was identical. The isolation from friends and family followed the same pattern. The pregnancy situations all involved some form of reproductive coercion. We weren't crazy. We weren't alone. And sitting together proved my father's behavior was a system he refined over decades. My father tried to contact my grandmother to get her to pressure me, but she called Rowan's investigator instead and told him my father was asking her to lie to the court about his finances. Her voice shook on the recording as she admitted he wanted her to say she gave him money to help raise me, to explain away some of the child support he stole. She was scared of losing her son, but also starting to see what he really was. When the investigator asked if she knew about the other women, she broke down crying and said she should have told the truth years ago. The investigator sent the recording to Kenneth, and suddenly we had evidence my father was trying to tamper with witnesses. 2 days later, the restaurant board in Paris released a statement on their website supporting my mother completely. They shared resources about postpartum mental health and condemned the cowardly blackmail attempt, explaining that they stood behind their head chef and her courage in speaking about her past trauma. Several prominent chefs posted messages of solidarity on social media, and my mother cried reading them because she expected to lose everything. Victor told me she spent the whole flight over convinced the restaurant would fire her, that her career was finished, that my father would finally succeed in destroying what she built. Instead, she was getting support from her professional community, and the blackmail photos my father threatened to release had lost their power. Kenneth Harmon brought formal charges against my father 3 weeks after the blackmail texts. Extortion, fraud, stalking, and criminal harassment based on the restraining order violations he kept committing. The bail hearing happened fast. Kenneth argued my father was a danger to multiple women based on the pattern evidence. The judge set bail at $200,000 because of the 20-year history of targeting and trapping women. My father was arrested at his workplace, walked out in handcuffs in front of his coworkers. I found out about it when Kenneth called to tell me it was done. I was sitting in my apartment when I got the news. I just stared at my phone for a long time, trying to process that my father was actually facing consequences. Alicia texted the group chat asking if everyone was okay, and responses flooded in from all 6 of us. We were scared. We were relieved. We were angry. We were hopeful. And we were together in this in a way none of us expected when we woke up a month ago. The news stations picked up the story within hours of my father's arrest. I was scrolling through my phone when I saw the headline on the local news website, "Men arrested for 20-year pattern of reproductive coercion and financial fraud." They didn't use his name in the headline, but the article had his booking photo. Suddenly my phone started buzzing with texts from people I hadn't talked to in years. Some were supportive, some were nosy, some just wanted details. I turned my phone off and sat on my couch staring at the wall. Rowan called my landline 2 days later to tell me 3 more women contacted his office after seeing the news coverage. They all dated my father briefly at different points over the last 15 years and experienced similar controlling behavior. One of them said he tried to sabotage her birth control, but she caught him. Another said he became obsessed after 2 dates and started showing up at her work. The third said he proposed after 3 weeks and got angry when she said it was too fast. None of them pressed charges at the time, but now they wanted to give statements. Kenneth added their information to the growing file of evidence showing my father's pattern. I started therapy twice a week instead of once. Dr. Rodriguez squeezed me into her schedule on Tuesday and Friday afternoons. We sat in her office, working through the reality that I existed because my father deliberately trapped my mother. Some sessions I could talk about it clinically, separating myself from the circumstances of my conception. Other sessions I could barely breathe, thinking about how my entire life started with his calculated abuse. Dr. Rodriguez helped me understand that my worth isn't determined by how I came into the world. But some days that knowledge didn't make the weight any lighter. She gave me exercises for when the thoughts got too heavy, breathing patterns, grounding techniques, ways to separate my identity from my origins. I practiced them at home, in my car, in the grocery store, when I suddenly remembered that my father researched family law before getting my mother pregnant. My mother flew back from Paris for a week, and we spent hours in my apartment talking about her 2 years of trying to be a parent while drowning in postpartum psychosis. She brought journals from that time. I read entries where she wrote about loving me desperately while also being terrified she'd hurt me. The handwriting got shaky in some entries, almost illegible in others. One entry from 3 weeks before her suicide attempt just said, "I can't. I can't. I can't," over and over for 2 pages. Another entry described my father documenting every moment she struggled, every time she cried, every instance of her asking for help. He was building his case for custody while she was barely surviving. She showed me a photo from my 2nd birthday party. She's holding me in the picture, but her eyes are completely empty, and my father is in the background with his phone out, recording. He used her illness against her while pretending to support her. Victor called every night to check on her, and I could hear the worry in his voice, even through the phone. Alicia became someone I talked to almost daily. She flew in again 3 weeks after the arrest and stayed for a few days, meeting me for coffee and walking around the city while we processed everything. She told me about her own therapy journey after escaping my father, how it took years to trust anyone again, how she almost didn't get married because she was so afraid of being trapped. But she did get married 10 years ago and had 2 kids she chose to have and worked helping other women navigate reproductive health care. She showed me photos of her family and talked about how healing it was to make those choices for herself. She became this unexpected mentor figure who helped me see that my father's destruction doesn't have to define the rest of my life. We texted throughout the week between her visits, and she always knew when I was having a bad day before I even said anything. The preliminary hearing got scheduled for 6 weeks out, and Rowan started preparing us for my father's defense strategy. He explained that my father's lawyer would likely try to attack each woman's credibility individually, suggesting we were lying or exaggerating or misremembering. Kenneth assured us the pattern evidence made that approach much harder to succeed with because it wasn't just one woman's word against my father's, but 6 women describing identical behavior across 2 decades. We had multiple preparation sessions where Rowan walked us through potential questions and how to answer them clearly and calmly. He reminded us to stick to facts, to not get defensive, to let the evidence speak for itself. 2 weeks before the hearing, my father's lawyer filed a motion to exclude the therapy notes, arguing doctor-patient privilege protected them from being admitted as evidence. Dr. Rodriguez's attorney fought back, arguing the mandatory reporting exception for ongoing harm and pattern of abuse. The hearing on the motion took 3 hours, and I sat in the back of the courtroom watching the judge review the notes page by page. My father's lawyer kept saying the notes were prejudicial and violated his privacy rights. Dr. Rodriguez's attorney pointed out that my father wrote about his plans to trap and control women, that the notes documented ongoing criminal behavior, that keeping them secret would allow him to continue hurting people. The judge took 2 days to decide, and then ruled the notes were admissible. Rowan called me immediately, and I could hear the relief in his voice. "This is huge," he said. "The notes establish premeditation and pattern. They show this wasn't impulsive or emotional, but calculated and systematic." I felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight since the blackmail texts. The preliminary hearing happened on a cold morning in late October. I wore a simple blue dress and kept my hair pulled back because Rowan said to look professional but approachable. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, and my father sat at a table with his lawyer, wearing a suit that probably cost more than my rent. He didn't look at me when I walked in. I took the stand first, and the prosecutor, working with Kenneth, walked me through the blackmail texts and the stolen child support money. I read the texts out loud in court, my voice steady, even though my hands shook holding the printed copies. My father's lawyer tried to suggest I misunderstood his intent, that he was just upset about the lawsuit, that the texts were taken out of context. I explained there's no context where threatening to destroy someone's career with photos from their mental health crisis is acceptable. The lawyer asked if I was sure my father stole the money or if maybe my mother was lying about sending it. I pulled out the bank statements showing every monthly transfer for 18 years, all deposited into accounts with my father's name. Th. E. Judge looked increasingly annoyed with the lawyer's questions. My mother testified next about the reproductive coercion, the financial abuse, and the 2 years of hell my father put her through while she was severely mentally ill. My father's lawyer tried to suggest she was lying or misremembering because of her mental health history. Kenneth objected immediately, and the judge sustained it, telling the lawyer to move on. My mother described my father sabotaging her birth control, threatening to destroy her career if she didn't have me, documenting her psychosis to use against her in custody court. She had medical records, psychiatric evaluations, and commitment papers that made everything she said impossible to deny. My father stared at the table the whole time she talked. Alicia testified about the college incident, the threats, the restraining order she had to get, and 20 years of wondering if he'd done it to others. She brought the emails he sent, threatening to tell her parents about the abortion and contact medical schools with character concerns. My father's face went red when she read one email out loud where he wrote that she'd regret choosing her career over their child. The judge asked to see the emails and spent several minutes reading them while the courtroom stayed silent. Alicia's voice only shook once, when she talked about transferring universities to escape him. Hannah testified via video link from Seattle because she couldn't take time off work to fly here. She described the stalking, showing up at her classes and dorm, the gifts he sent, the tampering with condoms. She explained how he admitted doing it because they were meant to have a family together. Her face on the screen looked pale but determined. Courtney testified in person about the fake vasectomy and his disappearance after her miscarriage. Her voice shook, but she got through it, describing how he promised marriage and forever and then blocked her number and moved without telling her. She brought text messages where he talked about baby names and nursery colors. The judge took notes through all of it. The judge set down her pen and looked directly at my father for the first time since testimony started. She said the evidence was more than enough to bind him over for trial on all charges. And based on the pattern of behavior, plus multiple restraining order violations, she was raising his bail to $2 million. My father's face went white as the bailiff walked over to him. Kenneth stood and added that my father had shown continued disregard for court orders and posed an ongoing threat to multiple victims. The judge agreed and ordered him held without bail pending trial. 2 bailiffs moved to either side of my father and put handcuffs on him right there at the defense table. He tried to turn and look at me, but one of the bailiffs put a hand on his shoulder and guided him toward the side door. I watched him get let out in handcuffs and felt this weird mix of relief and complete exhaustion, like I'd been holding my breath for months and finally let it out. My mother reached over and squeezed my hand, and Alicia put her arm around my shoulders from the other side. We all sat there for a minute after he was gone. Nobody saying anything, just processing what just happened. Rowan came over and told us this was a huge win, that the judge clearly saw through the defense's attempts to discredit the victims. Kenneth joined us and explained the next steps, but honestly, I barely heard him because my ears were ringing and my hands wouldn't stop shaking. 3 weeks passed before Rowan called me about a development. My father's lawyer contacted him about a possible plea deal. They were offering to plead guilty to the fraud and extortion charges if we dropped the stalking and harassment charges. Kenneth was willing to consider it because it would spare all of us from going through a full trial, but he wanted our input before making any decisions. I immediately texted the group chat we set up with all 6 primary victims plus supporters. Within an hour, we scheduled an emergency coalition meeting at Rowan's office for the next day. I spent that whole night lying awake, thinking about whether I wanted to face my father in a trial or just be done with this whole thing. Part of me wanted him to face maximum consequences for everything he did. Another part of me just wanted it over so I could start actually healing instead of living in this constant legal battle stress. The meeting happened in Rowan's big conference room with all 6 of us victims, plus Victor and Felix. Hannah joined via video call from Seattle since she couldn't take more time off work. Rowan laid out the plea offer in detail, explaining what charges would stick and what would get dropped. Kenneth was there too and walked us through what a trial would look like versus accepting a plea. Hannah spoke first through the screen, saying she really didn't want to testify again in a full trial, that the preliminary hearing was hard enough, and she wasn't sure she could handle cross-examination. Courtney immediately said she wanted maximum consequences and didn't trust that a plea deal would actually punish him enough for 20 years of hurting women. Alicia stayed quiet for a while, then said she'd support whatever the group decided because we were all in this together. The other 3 victims shared their thoughts, 2 leaning toward the plea to avoid trial trauma, 1 wanting to push for maximum charges. We went back and forth for almost 2 hours, everyone sharing their fears and needs and what they thought would help them move forward. Sitting there listening to everyone, I realized this decision isn't really about punishment at all. It's about what will actually help each of us heal and move forward with our lives. Some of us needed the closure of him admitting guilt publicly. Some of us needed to avoid the trauma of reliving everything in detailed trial testimony. Some of us needed to see him face serious consequences. All of those needs were valid, and they didn't all point to the same answer. I suggested we vote on accepting a plea deal only if it included significant prison time, full financial restitution to my mother, and whatever registration was required under state law. Everyone agreed that was a good framework. We voted, and it was 5 in favor of accepting a plea with those terms, 1 against. Courtney was the holdout, but she said she'd accept the group decision even though she personally wanted him to face trial. Kenneth told us he'd go back to the defense with our conditions and see what they countered with. The plea negotiation dragged on for 2 more weeks, with Kenneth pushing hard for 5 years in prison. My father's lawyer kept arguing for probation, claiming my father had no prior record and showed remorse. Kenneth sent me updates every few days, and each time I felt this knot in my stomach, wondering if my father would get off easy. Finally, they reached a settlement that Kenneth thought was the best we'd get without going to trial: 3 years in prison, 5 years probation. And after release, full restitution of $800,000 plus interest to my mother, and mandatory counseling for the entire probation period. Kenneth called each of us victims individually to get our final approval. When he called me, I asked if 3 years was enough for 20 years of abuse. He was quiet for a second, then said, "No, prison time is really enough, but 3 years is significant, and the restitution plus probation conditions mean ongoing consequences for years." I told him I approved the deal. The plea hearing was scheduled for the following week. My father had to allocate, which Kenneth explained meant stating exactly what he did in open court as part of accepting the plea. I sat in the front row with my mother, Victor, Alicia, Hannah on video link, and Courtney. My father stood at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit, looking smaller than I remembered. The judge asked him to state his plea, and he said guilty in this flat voice. Then she made him go through each charge and explain what he actually did. He had to say out loud that he deliberately tampered with birth control to get my mother pregnant against her will. He had to admit he stole child support payments for 18 years, cashing checks meant for my care, and hiding the money. He had to confess to extorting me and my mother with photos from her mental health crisis. Hearing him say these things in his own voice felt completely surreal but also necessary, like he was finally being forced to name what he did instead of hiding behind excuses. His voice shook when he admitted to tampering with birth control, and I wondered if he was actually feeling guilt or just performing for the judge. The judge accepted his plea and sentenced him to 3 years in state prison, followed by 5 years probation. 3 months after the plea hearing, I got a call from Rowan about the financial case. Talia Redmond, the family court judge handling that part, had ordered my father to liquidate all his hidden assets immediately to pay the full restitution to my mother. The boat got sold at auction. The motorcycle collection got picked up by a dealer who paid cash. The investment properties went on the market and sold within weeks because they were actually decent properties in good locations. Everything my father built with my mother's stolen money got converted to cash and handed over. Rowan called my mother directly when the check arrived, and I was on the phone with her when she opened the envelope. $873,000, the full amount plus interest. She started crying and couldn't talk for a minute. Victor took the phone and told me they were going to set up a trust fund for my education and donate a portion to organizations helping abuse survivors. My mother got back on the phone and said she never thought she'd actually see this money again. That part of her believed my father would find a way to hide it forever. My grandmother contacted me one more time about a month after my father started serving his sentence. She sent a long email asking if I'd visit him in prison because he was still my father and family is supposed to forgive. She wrote that he was suffering and lonely and needs his daughter's support. She said, "Everyone makes mistakes and holding grudges only hurts me in the end." I read the email 3 times, feeling this old familiar guilt trying to creep back in. Then I wrote back a single paragraph. I told her that being related to someone doesn't obligate me to accept abuse or support them through consequences of their own actions. I explained that I'm done protecting people who hurt others just because they're family. I said I hope she finds peace, but I won't be visiting my father now or ever. She doesn't respond, and I hear through extended family that she moved to another state to live with her sister. The family fracture was complete and permanent, but I felt clear about my choice in a way I never did before. For months after that, Dr. Rodriguez called me with news about the licensing board investigation. They'd cleared her of any ethical violations after reviewing the mandatory reporting exception and all the evidence of ongoing harm my father was causing. She sounded almost shocked telling me this, like she really expected to lose her license. The board actually gave her a formal commendation for her courage in coming forward and helping stop a serial predator. When we met for our regular therapy session the next week, she told me privately that the investigation was terrifying and there were nights she couldn't sleep wondering if she'd destroyed her career. But she said she'd do it again because staying silent would have been worse than any professional consequence. I thanked her for risking everything to help me and all the other women my father hurt. She got tears in her eyes and said, "Watching us support each other through this has been the most meaningful work of her career." 6 months after my father sent those blackmail texts, I was sitting in my mother's restaurant in Paris with Victor, Alicia, Hannah, and Courtney, who all flew in for what we're calling a Survivor Summit, but is really just us supporting each other and celebrating making it through. The restaurant was closed for a private event, which was us. My mother cooked us a 7-course meal, each dish more incredible than the last. Between courses, we talked about where we were now, what we were doing with our lives, how we were healing. Hannah got a promotion at the public defender office. Courtney started grad school for counseling. Alicia's hospital gave her an award for her advocacy work. Victor kept refilling our wine glasses and making toasts in French that my mother translated. When dessert came out, my mother stood up with her own glass and made a toast. To surviving. To justice. To women supporting women. And to building lives our abusers never wanted us to have. We all raised our glasses. I looked around the table at these women who were strangers 6 months ago and were now forever connected by shared trauma and shared victory. My mother's eyes met mine across the table, and she smiled with tears running down her face. I smiled back and felt something shift inside me, like maybe I was finally becoming the person I was supposed to be before my father's lies shaped my whole life. The weeks after Paris brought a rhythm I never expected to have with my mother. We video call every Tuesday and Friday evening, her in her restaurant kitchen during prep time, me in my apartment between classes. She shows me how to properly dice vegetables while I tell her about my therapy sessions and the legal proceedings still wrapping up. Sometimes Victor joins the calls and makes jokes in French that my mother translates, and I'm learning their language slowly through an app she recommended. We're planning for me to spend 8 weeks in Paris next summer. My mother already has a list of places she wants to take me, recipes she wants to teach me, stories she wants to share about the 20 years we lost. It's not the relationship we would have built if my father hadn't destroyed her, but it's real and growing. And that matters more than the perfection we'll never have. The restitution money sat in my account like a weight and an opportunity at the same time. I paid off my remaining college tuition in one payment, and my academic advisor actually called me to make sure the payment wasn't a mistake. The rest I split between my future and helping others. Alicia flew in for a weekend, and we spent 2 days at my kitchen table with a lawyer she knew, setting up a nonprofit fund for survivors of reproductive coercion. We called it the Autonomy Project. Within a week of launching our website, we got our first grant application from a woman in Oregon whose partner sabotaged her IUD. Alicia handled most of the administrative work since she had experience running hospital programs, but I reviewed every application and wrote personal responses to each woman who reached out. Some of their stories made me cry, but helping them access resources for legal aid, therapy, and financial support felt like turning my father's theft into something that actually helps people. Hannah emailed me 3 months after Paris with an idea for a legal journal article about reproductive coercion and the gaps in current law. We spent hours on video calls mapping out our argument, pulling research, interviewing other survivors from our growing coalition. She wrote the legal analysis while I handled the personal narratives and policy recommendations. The article got published 6 months later in a family law journal, and suddenly we were getting invitations to speak at law schools about the issue. Our first speaking engagement was at Hannah's alma mater in Seattle. Standing in front of 70 law students talking about my father's crimes felt surreal but necessary. After our presentation, 5 students approached us privately to share their own experiences with reproductive coercion, and Hannah and I exchanged a look that said we were doing something that matters. Courtney sent me a photo of her acceptance letter to a graduate counseling program 4 months after the plea deal. She was going back to school to become a therapist specializing in intimate partner abuse, and she told me our coalition helped her realize she wants to help other women recognize and escape controlling relationships before they get trapped. her brother Felix, who helped us track down my father's online activities, developed a safety app for documenting abuse evidence that encrypts photos and messages in a way that abusers can't access or delete. He launched it for free, and within 2 months, over 1,000 women had downloaded it. Courtney beta tested every feature and provided feedback from a survivor's perspective. Watching her transform her trauma into purpose reminded me that healing looks different for everyone. Kenneth Harmon called me 10 months into my father's sentence with news that made my stomach turn. My father had been violating probation rules repeatedly by trying to contact victims through intermediaries, using other inmates' phone privileges to leave messages, sending letters through his mother to our addresses. Each violation added time to his sentence. Kenneth told me this pattern showed my father still didn't accept responsibility for his actions. He wasn't learning or changing, just finding new ways to maintain control even from prison. The prison psychologist's reports described him as manipulative and lacking genuine remorse, more concerned with being caught than with the harm he caused. Kenneth said my father would likely serve his full 3 years, plus additional time for the violations. While part of me felt satisfied by this, another part just felt tired of him still taking up space in our lives. My grandmother called me once from her new place in another state, and I almost didn't answer. She was living with her sister now, unable to face the community judgment and the whispers that followed her at church and the grocery store. She wanted to know if I'd ever forgive her, if there was a path back to having a relationship. I told her honestly that I felt sad about losing her, but also clear that her choice to protect my father over his victims made this outcome the only one possible. She chose her son over the truth, over me, over every woman he hurt, and those choices have consequences. She cried and told me she loved me, and I said, I know, but love isn't enough when it comes with silence about abuse. We hung up, and I blocked her number because I needed to focus on moving forward, not on people who chose to look away. 2 years after the plea deal, I walked across the stage at my college graduation in a blue gown that cost more than I would have been able to afford before the restitution. My mother and Victor flew in from Paris, and Alicia drove up from her city, and Hannah took time off from the public defender's office to be here. Dr. Rodriguez sat with them in the audience. After the ceremony, we took a photo together that I posted on social media with a caption about the importance of women supporting women. My mother cried through the whole ceremony, and when I found her afterward, she hugged me so tight I could barely breathe. Victor took dozens of photos of us together, and my mother kept saying she's so proud, and I believed her completely. We went to dinner at a nice restaurant, and my mother ordered wine for everyone and made a toast to surviving, and to futures that our abusers tried to steal. The table raised glasses, and I looked around at these people who showed up for me, who helped me fight, who became my real family. 3 months after graduation, my mother called me, screaming in French before switching to English. Her restaurant just got its 2nd Michelin star, jumping from 1 to 2 in a single year. She was sobbing and laughing at the same time, and I could hear Victor cheering in the background and her staff applauding. She told me the Michelin inspectors cited her creative risks and bold flavor combinations, and she credited the support she received during the scandal for giving her the courage to stop playing it safe. A food magazine interviewed her the next week, and she told them that surviving my father's abuse taught her she's stronger than she ever knew, that facing her worst fears about her past being exposed freed her to take risks in her cooking. The article ran with a photo of her in her chef's whites, looking confident and proud, and I framed it and hung it in my apartment. My law school acceptance letter arrived on a Tuesday in April. A thick envelope from a school known for its family law program. I got in with a scholarship that covers half tuition, and the restitution money means I can attend without taking on debt. I'm going to specialize in family law and victim advocacy, inspired by Rowan's work, and determined to help other people navigate systems that often fail survivors. The acceptance felt like justice transforming into opportunity, like my father's stolen money becoming the foundation for me to help other people fight abusers like him. I called my mother first, and she cried, then Alec. Who said she knew I'd get in, then Hannah, who offered to mentor me through law school since she remembers how hard it was. Dr. Rodriguez sent me a card with a note saying she's proud of the woman I've become, and I keep it in my desk drawer to read on hard days. 3 years after I found my mother's Instagram and sent that angry message that started everything, our coalition of survivors held its 3rd annual gathering. We'd grown from the original 6 of us to 12 women my father targeted over 2 decades, plus countless others we've helped through the nonprofit. We met at a retreat center for a weekend, sharing updates about our lives, supporting each other through hard days, celebrating victories big and small. Alicia brought her kids, and they played with Courtney's niece while we talked. Hannah presented research on new reproductive coercion laws being proposed in 4 states. Felix demoed the latest version of his safety app. My mother and Victor cooked us a feast on Saturday night, and we ate together at a long table, survivors and allies and chosen family. On Sunday morning, before everyone leaves, we stood in a circle, and each person shared one thing they'd reclaimed from their trauma. Alicia said her trust in her own judgment. Hannah said her belief that the legal system can work if you fight hard enough. Courtney said her ability to help others without losing herself. My mother said, "My daughter." When it was my turn, I said, "My future," and everyone nodded like they understood exactly what I meant. 2 months after that gathering, I met someone at a community event who asked me about my advocacy work and actually listened when I explained my boundaries about personal questions. We started dating slowly, with me being upfront about my history and the trust issues that come with it. Some mornings I wake up anxious that they're trying to control me somehow, checking my phone too much or second-guessing their kindness. But my therapist helps me separate past trauma from present reality. My partner never pushes, never makes me feel guilty for needing space. And on the days when I struggle, they just sit with me and wait until I'm ready to talk. It's different from anything I imagined a relationship could be. Built on honesty instead of manipulation, and that makes it worth the hard work of learning to trust again. My mother suggested a trip to the coast in early fall, just the 2 of us, and I took a week off from my nonprofit work to go. We rented a small house right on the water and spent our days cooking together in the tiny kitchen, her teaching me techniques she uses at the restaurant while I told her about law school applications and the women we've helped through the coalition. She made this incredible fish dish one night using local catch, and I watched her work, seeing the confidence she's rebuilt over the past few years. We talked about the 2 years she tried to parent me while drowning in psychosis, and she cried telling me she's sorry for all the time we lost, but proud of who I've become anyway. I told her I'm proud of her, too, for surviving my father's abuse and building a whole new life. We spent an evening just sitting on the beach watching the sunset, without needing to say anything else. On our last morning there, she made me breakfast and said she wishes she could have been there for all my other breakfasts growing up, but she's grateful for everyone we get to share now. I started law school the following January with a full scholarship and a clear focus on family law and victim advocacy. Inspired by everything Rowan did for us and determined to help other people navigate systems that fail survivors too often. The restitution money my father stole now sits in an account, funding my education and the nonprofit, which feels like justice transforming into something useful instead of just punishment. I'm happy now, in a way that feels earned through surviving and fighting and refusing to let my father's abuse define my entire life. The work I do, helping other women document reproductive coercion and financial abuse, feels meaningful because I know exactly what they're facing. My relationships with my mother, with Alicia, with Hannah and Courtney, and all the other survivors, feel genuine because we've seen each other at our worst and chosen to support each other anyway. I still think about the 20 years I spent hating my mother for abandoning me, believing my father's lies, and it still hurts knowing how much time we lost. But I also know that speaking up about what he did helped protect other women from becoming his next victims, and the coalition we built gives survivors resources I wish I'd had earlier. My mother introduces me to her restaurant staff as my daughter with tears in her eyes every single time, and I've stopped feeling awkward about it. Because I understand now that she's claiming something my father tried to steal from both of us. The life I'm building feels solid and real, constructed from the pieces of pain my father left behind, but transformed into something he never intended. Some days are still hard, and I still go to therapy twice a week, and I still sometimes wake up anxious about control and trust. But I have meaningful work ahead of me and people who see and value me for who I actually am. And I've learned that surviving something terrible doesn't mean staying broken forever. What would you do if you discovered your entire life was built on a lie? Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and painful truth? Share your thoughts below. I'm genuinely curious to hear your perspectives.